Pastor Ed here with Daily Devotions for Saturday, March the 11th, 2023, the last of our daily devotions for this week. And we're kind of coming back to where the week started, at least on this past Sunday, with the parable of the laborers in the vineyard. We've talked about parables this week. We've talked about how they were very often earthly stories with a heavenly meaning, that they're very often have a twist, and they force us to look at things differently, and they typically describe how they begin, really kind of clues us into who the parable is about. And so often it's, in the case of the laborers, it's about the vineyard owner. It's not so much about the different laborers. Somebody once wrote a modern version, and it kind of keeps a lot of the same details. It goes like this: a large multinational retail giant moved into a new city. We'll call it Stuff Mart. And they put an ad in the paper inviting applications for people to work for 1 month to stock the shelves. And they received 100 applications. And the manager went through them all, chose the best 25, and offered them a job. And at the end of the month, he said, "I'll pay you $2,000 cash." And they agreed and went to work. Well, 1 week into the month, he phoned another 25, "Come and work. And at the end of the month, I'll pay you a fair wage." The next week, he phoned the next 25, made the same offer. Finally, the last week, he phoned the final group of 25 people, the ones with no education, lousy references, a series of bad jobs, many of whom hadn't even filled out the application properly, obviously couldn't even spell, but they too came and worked. And at the end of the month, he called everyone together, lined them up to pay. The lowly poor workers who had come for only 1 week were first. They hadn't been particularly productive due to their lack of many very basic skills, but as they approached the table, the manager handed them each 20 $100 bills. Imagine their reaction. And those who'd been hired at the beginning of the month got excited. "We slaved all month long. We worked much harder, accomplished much more. I wonder what we'll get paid." And when their turn came, they also received 20 $100 bills. And they got upset. They called Buzz Hargrove and the International Stuff Mart Union and lodged a protest. "It's not fair," they cried. "We worked all month and accomplished much more than the losers you hired just last week. We deserve more than them." The manager replied, "Friend, I'm not being unfair to you. Didn't you agree to work for $2,000? Take your pay and go. I want to give those who were hired last the same as I gave you. Don't I have the right to do what I want with my own money? Or are you envious because I am generous?" Janine Brown, a New Testament scholar, has said Jesus often spoke in parables to express something about God and God's ways in the world. And these parables, these stories drawn from mundane, ordinary realities, frequently ended with, as I said earlier, a twist. Jesus would start a storyline, lull his hearers into thinking that they knew where the story was going and how it would end. And then the story would take a surprising turn, intended to awaken the hearer to a different reality, a different way of seeing the world and living in it. A Samaritan who proves to be the ideal neighbor, or a king who surprised his followers by being identified with the least of these. And in our lesson this past Sunday, a landowner who virtually gives away a full day's wage to harvesters who've only worked for a single hour. And we know the details. He hires a group of people at the beginning of the day and then throughout the day, and yet at the end of the day, they all get paid the same wage. She writes, all the previous hires are simply plot interprelude to the key scene of the parable in which the landowner pays each group of workers. He tells the story so that the last hour workers are paid first and the first hour workers are paid last. And the narrative device prepares for the story's conflict. The people who labored for 12 hours are privy to the landowner's generosity in giving a full day's wage to those who worked only 1 hour. And even though this is the same wage that they had been promised, they expected to be given more than this. More generosity shown than was shown to the last hour workers. And it's here, she says, that we, the readers, likely experience the discomfort of the plot twist. Doesn't it seem supremely unfair to pay the same wage for the work of 12 hours as for 1 hour? If an employer did this today, they might be reported to the U.S. Department of Labor. If we haven't been identifying at all with those first hour workers, we might very well exclaim with them, "These last workers worked only 1 hour and you've made them equal to us." But she says, remember how the parable began. The kingdom of heaven is like a landowner. And the framework of generosity for understanding God's and God's ways is what's emphasized. Friend, I do you no wrong. And the language she points out here, that word wrong can also be translated as unjust. And so the landowner disavows any injustice on his part, and he claims it's his right to use his resources as he chooses. The affront of the parable centers on God's generosity and grace that's given to all equally. God's deep generosity towards others can actually trip us up if we think the kingdom in terms of limited amounts of grace being distributed based on deservedness. Somebody once said, when we get to heaven, there'll be no contest to see who was the most deserving of God's grace, because no one deserves it. There'll only be one contest in heaven, when we look back and see what we were before, when we see the pit from which he rescued us, when we recall how confused we were, when we remember how God reached out and hired us into his family, and how he held us in his hand, and when we see Jesus who loved us and gave himself for us. The only contest will be to see which of us sings the loudest, "Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found, was blind, but now I see." It's all about grace. And on that note, we'll end this week. Hope you can join us tomorrow for our worship. We actually have another parable, the parable of the wedding guests and the invitation. Then we'll be back next week. I suspect we'll be talking a little bit more about parables then as well. So until then, take care. Again, hope you worship with us tomorrow or sometime during the week on our YouTube channel. Till then, until Tuesday, take care. Bye.